Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from KnittingHouseSquare, and today I have a fun and easy knitting tutorial for you. Now this won't be a quick knitting tutorial, but it is great for beginners. So what I'm going to be showing you today, and I'm sure you've already seen it in the thumbnail, is how to knit this simple basket weave blanket. So I'm going to take you through all the steps you need to know from cast on to cast off. So we'll start with this simple backward loop cast on. I'll show you how to work the knit and purl stitch if you aren't familiar with working those before. And then I'll show you how to work that traditional basket weave stitch all the way up through the pattern. So the finished measurements of this, it's kind of like a large throw, I would say. It measures 50 inches wide. That's how many stitches we're going to cast on. And then we work the pattern for a total of 60 inches. It is knit out of a bulky weight yarn, so that makes the project go a little bit faster. For my project, I used the Bernat Blanket Yarn. I also want to mention before we get started here that this will be part of a two-part series where in this video I'm showing you the blanket. I will also have, in my next tutorial that I come out with, probably keep an eye out for it over the next week or two, another great beginner project using the same basket weave stitch. This one I'm going to be showing you how to make a basket weave scarf. So if you're looking for a bit smaller of a project, you may want to keep an eye out for that one. As always, all the resources and the full pattern are available for free on my website, KnittingHouseSquare.com, which you'll find linked down below. So now, let's get started on the basket weave blanket. Now for this project, I used about 4 balls of the Bernat Blanket Yarn. I would recommend, if you're preparing for this project, to buy a 5th one, just so then you have enough in case you end up using it. Now, what's specific about Bernat Blanket Yarn do you need to know for your materials? The main thing you need to know is your knitting needle size. And I would recommend trying out 2 knitting needle sizes before you decide on the one you want to use here. So this yarn recommends a US 11 knitting needle. So I would knit 1 swatch out of the recommended US 11 knitting needle. And then for me personally, I found that I actually preferred a little bit tighter of a fabric, so I went down instead to US 10.5. And let me show you examples of what those 2 swatches looked like. So here are my 2 swatches that I knit with 2 different knitting needles. So the one over here on the right, I knit using the recommended on the label US 11 knitting needle. And what I found when I used that was that this fabric was a little bit too loose in what I was looking for in the blanket. It does make a really nice fabric, so if you prefer this style, you may want to go with that US 11. I wanted something a little bit tighter, so then I went down 1 knitting needle size to the US 10.5, and it created this fabric here. So you still have the openings, but it's just a little bit tighter of a fabric overall, and this was the look I was going for. So my gauge in working this and how I knit this swatch is I cast on 21 stitches, then I worked a few repeats of the pattern and cast off. So 21 stitches was what both of these were cast on with. That way I could get a nice little sample comparison. And my gauge I ended up with was 12 stitches is 5.5 inches and 12 rows is 3 inches. And I'll put that up here on the screen. So 12 stitches is 5.5 inches and 12 rows is 3 inches. So that's the gauge I'm going to be working off of when I tell you how many stitches to cast on for this throw size blanket. Once you've selected your knitting needle size between that US 11 or US 10.5, you need a long cord on your knitting needle. So you don't want to knit this blanket using straight knitting needles because there won't be enough space. So I would recommend getting a circular knitting needle with a long cord, something around that 60-inch mark. 48 inches would work as well. That way we have plenty of space to hold all those stitches as we work back and forth across our blanket. Last few things I'd recommend having: a tape measure so that you can measure your progress along the way, a pair of scissors to cut your yarn, and then you're going to need a tapestry needle at the end of the project to weave in your ends. Step 1 is casting on. So to get that 50-inch width that we're going for this throw, we need to cast on 111 stitches. So the cast on method I'm going to be showing you here is a simple cast on method called the backward loop cast on. You can use any cast on method that you'd like, just make sure it creates a nice, simple, stretchy edge. The backward loop cast on starts by creating a slip knot. So you want your ball of yarn further away from you and your tail of yarn, or where that ball of yarn starts, closer to you. And you want to just lay that tail of yarn over your left hand so that the yarn tail is closest to you. You want a little bit of space here as well, because we're going to need to weave in this end later on. Now we're going to grab onto this yarn tail with our bottom 3 fingers, and now we want to start looping this thread or yarn around our pointer finger. So I'm going to go up here to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top again, back behind down to the bottom. Now I'm going to grab onto that other strand with my bottom 3 fingers as well. So if I look at my pointer finger, I have kind of like 2 full loops and then a half loop over here. So the slip knot, I do this by rearranging these top 2 loops. So first up, I'm going to take the middle loop and I'm going to slide it up closer to the top of my finger, so it becomes the new first loop. Going to take the new middle loop, slide it up closer to the top of my finger, and then take that newest middle loop, slide it off of my finger, and now I have a slip knot. What do I want to do with this slip knot? I want to put it on either one of my knitting needle points. Doesn't matter which one I pick, but I want to do it for my knitting needle where I put in the knitting needle point going from the right to the left, and then I gently pull on that yarn tail to tighten it onto my knitting needle. You don't want it so tight that it doesn't move. You want there to still be movement in those stitches. Now we can start casting on. And the nice thing about the backward loop cast on is it actually looks very similar to that slip knot we were just creating. I like to hold the yarn tail over here in my right hand as I'm holding onto this knitting needle. That way I don't accidentally cast on with it. And with my left hand, I'm gonna put that behind my strand of yarn, grab onto it with my bottom 3 fingers, and now I have to start looping this pointer finger. So I'm gonna go down below, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top. So it's like I have 1.5 loops around my finger. I'm now going to take my right hand and that knitting needle. I'm going to pick up that topmost loop off my left hand, gently slide it off of my left hand's finger and onto the knitting needle, and gently pull on it so that it becomes tighter, but again, leave some space. Don't make it too tight. You want to still be able to slide them around. Now don't drop that strand in your left hand. What you want to do now is you want to go back behind, down the bottom, up the front to the top. Now you've made a new loop, and now you want to slide that loop off of your left finger onto the knitting needle. And again, just gently pull it so it tightens on. And you just want to keep on looping. So go back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, slide it off of your finger onto your knitting needle. Back behind down the bottom, up the front to the top, off your finger onto the knitting needle. Now if you ever accidentally let go, that's totally fine. You could reset up. So if you need to reset up, just take your left hand behind the strand of yarn, grab onto it with your bottom 3 fingers. And to do that initial setup, we have to loop twice. So I'm going to go down the bottom, up the front to the top, loop one more time, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top. And now we can start slipping the loops off of our left finger onto the knitting needle. So I'm going to continue to do this until I have a total of 111 loops over here on this knitting needle, and the slip knot does count as one of those loops. And you can keep on sliding them down as you go, right? They're going to take up a majority of this cord. Now, once you have those stitches cast on, don't forget to double count. So I always double count and make sure I do have that exactly 111. Okay, and I do. So now we're all ready to work the first row. The whole written version of the pattern is available on my website, which I'll have linked down below, and I'll also narrate to you the different steps as we go through them here in the video. So the first row, what it says is we need to purl 3, knit 3, and we want to repeat in between those stars all the way across the row until 3 stitches are left. Then we're purling the final 3 stitches. So when I start off my work here, I want to have my work with a working yarn or the ball of yarn attached to it in my left hand. And then I want to have my other knitting needle, which doesn't currently have any stitches on it because my stitches haven't quite spread out yet, but my free knitting needle in my other hand. So again, it said purl 3 first. So the way you work a purl stitch is you go into the front base of the stitch from right to left. You take your yarn and you wrap it going over towards the right, up above, then down below to the bottom, pull that snug, and then push that through the loop on your knitting needle. Slide the stitch off of your left knitting needle. So that was purl 1. We have to purl 3 total. So again, I'm going to go into the next stitch, going from the right to the left, back to the front, wrap my yarn up the right side, down the left side, and then push that loop through the stitch on my left knitting needle. Slide the stitch off of my left knitting needle. Again, same thing with the next stitch. Wrap my yarn up, then down, push that loop through, slide the stitch off of my left knitting needle. So now I've purled 3, and you should have 3 little bumps there in the front of your work. That's good, that's how you know you purled. And now I have to knit 3. When you're transitioning between the two, you want to make sure you're doing the correct thing of holding your yarn in the front of your work or the back of your work. So whenever you're purling, your yarn should be held in the front of your work. Whenever you're knitting, your yarn should be held in the back of the work. So we just finished the purl stitches. Now we have to knit. So we're going to go in between our 2 knitting needles to the back, and we're going to knit the next 3 stitches. So to knit, now I take my right knitting needle point and I go from the left to the right, front to back into the stitch. Then I take my yarn and I go up the left side of my knitting needle behind my work. I pull that tight, and then I pull that loop through the stitch on my left knitting needle. Slide the stitch off my left knitting needle. So let me show you that 2 more times here. I'm going to go into the base of my next stitch, left to right, front to back, take my yarn, go up behind the left side of my knitting needle, pull it snug, and then pull that loop through. Slide the stitch off my left knitting needle, and the next stitch, knit again, left to right, front to back, bring the yarn up the left side of that knitting needle, pull it snug, pull that loop through. Slide the stitch off of your left knitting needle. So the first 3 had bumps in the front. The next 3 don't have bumps in the front because we knit them. So it looks great so far. Now we have to purl 3 again. So we go through the same repeat, where we're going to purl 3, then knit 3. When I'm purling, my yarn has to be in the front of my work. So I'm going to bring it just in between my 2 knitting needles to the front. Now for purling, we go right to left, back to front, wrap the yarn up the right side, down the left side, and push that loop through, slide the stitch off. Purl the second one, purl the third one. Now we're going to bring our working yarn to the back because we have to knit, and we're going to knit 3, left to right, front to back. Pull that loop through, and knit the next 2. Great. So now again, if I look at my work, I have 3 bumps in the front for my 3 purl stitches, and then no bumps for my 3 knit stitches. and I'm gonna keep on alternating. Next up, I bring my yarn to the front. I'm gonna purl 3, then knit 3. I'm gonna continue this all the way across the row. And because we worked 111 stitches, we're gonna end up with 3 stitches at the end. We have to purl those 3. Now, once I finish purling that final stitch, I'm gonna turn my work. So I just flip it over. And now I wanna hold the knitting needle with all my stitches in it in my left hand and the free knitting needle over here in my right hand. So we just worked setup row 1, and now we're gonna work setup row 2. This row and all the rows beyond this point are gonna start off with slipping the first stitch. So the way we slip a stitch here is we're gonna go into the first stitch on the left knitting needle using our right knitting needle, purlwise. So we just wanna go from right to left, back to front, and then just pass it from the left to right knitting needle. You don't actually wanna work it. Now it says knit 2, and our yarn is already placed in the right location. It's already behind our work, so we don't have to move it at all. So now I'm gonna knit the first stitch, or really the second stitch, and then knit the next stitch here. So I just knit 2. Now we have the stars, and it says purl 3, knit 3. So we're gonna continue repeating purl 3, knit 3 over and over again all the way across the rest of the row. And what you should notice as you go across the row is it should line up with the stitches below it. So for example, the 3 stitches I'm gonna be purling currently have the bumps in the front. So I'm gonna bring my yarn to the front to purl and purl those 3 stitches that have the bumps. And now I just created 3 more stitches right on top of them that also have those bumps. Now I knit 3, so I bring my yarn to the back. These ones don't have the bumps in the front. So I'm gonna knit 1, 2, 3. Then I start over again. So I bring my yarn to the front, purl 3, bring my yarn to the back, knit 3, all the way across this row. When I finish that final knit 3 of setup row 2, again, I'm gonna flip my work, put the side with my working yarn and all my stitches over here in my left hand, and my right hand has the free knitting needle. For setup row 3, we're gonna start off again with a slip one. So in this case, because we're starting off with that purl stitch to the bump there, you wanna slip with the yarn in front, just the way it is right now. And you're gonna slip just like you did for the previous row. So you wanna take your knitting needle, right to left, back to front in that stitch, and then just pass it from one knitting needle to the next. Don't actually work it. Now it says purl 2, and again, our yarn is already exactly where it needs to be. So we're gonna purl the first stitch and purl that second stitch. So now we're a total of 3 stitches in, and now we begin the repeat. So the repeat is knit 3, purl 3, and we're gonna continue working that knit 3, purl 3 all the way across the row. And again here, you can see that the knits are gonna show up right above where we don't have the bumps. So we have knit 3, and then over here we have the bumps. So those are gonna be our purl 3s. I'm gonna bring my working yarn to the back, knit 3, bring my working yarn to the front, purl 3, and continue that all the way across the row. Once we complete that final purl stitch, we're gonna turn our work, and now we're all done those 3 setup rows. So what we're gonna be working on next is gonna be what I call set 1 and set 2 in the pattern. Each one of those consists of 3 rows, and these 6 rows total is gonna be what you're repeating all the way up through the total 60 inches. So the main thing to keep in mind is that every 3 rows, the pattern is gonna switch. What I mean by that is we just worked our 3 setup rows down here at the bottom, and you can see that among these 3 setup rows, right, I have all the flat stitches grouped together. Then I have all the bump stitches grouped together, then flat bumps, right? Going across the row. And it'll appear as the opposite on the other side of your work. Now when I begin set one, I'm going to be switching. So anywhere I had flat stitches, I now want to do bumps. And anywhere I have the bumps, I now want to do flat stitches. Once I switch the pattern, then I keep the pattern the same or the same texture for row 2 and 3 of each one of those sets. So on the next row, I'm going to be switching up my pattern. So let's look at that as an example here of row 1, set 1. What we have to do first is we have to slip the first stitch. Now when I slip this first stitch, I'm going to keep my working yarn in the back where it currently is. I'm just going to pass it, going purlwise, right to left, back to front, left to right knitting needle. And now I need to purl 2. So I'm going to bring my working yarn after I've slipped that stitch in between my 2 knitting needles to the front. And now I'm going to purl the first stitch, purl the second stitch. So now we've slipped 1, then purl 2. Now we have the stars telling us what to repeat across the row. So I'm going to do knit 3, then purl 3. And this is where it should be switched, right? So below it, we have the purl bumps, but I don't want to purl these anymore. I want to switch the pattern. So I'm going to knit where I have the bumps here on set 1, row 1. And then I need to bring my working yarn to the front, and where it was flat, I want to add in the bumps. So I'm going to purl 1, 2, 3. Then I can bring my yarn to the back again, knit 3, purl 3, and continue doing that knit 3, purl 3 all the way across this row. I'm finishing up set 1, row 1 with the final 3 purl stitches. And now I'm going to turn my work and I'm ready for set 1, row 2. So this is actually a row we worked before. And the way this one works is you slip the first stitch. You don't have to worry about where the yarn is. You can leave it where it is. And then it says knit 2. The working yarn is already in the back, so it's already in the correct position. So now we can just go right into knitting 2. And what you're going to notice about rows 2 and 3, both in set 1 and set 2, is you're working the same as the pattern that was below it, right? So we're keeping the stitches the same for each one of those sets of 3, then we're switching again, right, for the next set of 3. And that's how you create that alternating pattern. So on rows 2 and 3, anywhere I have the bumps below, right, so next up in my pattern, I have purl 3, and that perfectly matches up with where I have the bumps below. So I can bring my working yarn to the front, purl 3, then I've knit 3, and that matches up with me having no bumps there. So I bring my yarn to the back, knit 3. So this is an easy way to read your work as you're working along. That way your pattern stays consistent and you can visually see if you've made any mistakes as you go along. So I'm going to continue working rows 2 and 3 of this pattern, and then I'll come back and I'll show you the new row that we're going to have, which is going to be set 2, row 1, once I get there. I've just completed row 3 of set 1, and the last thing I wanted to show you here in the video tutorial is going to be how to work the first 2 or 3 stitches here of row 1, set 2. So again, the row 1s, we're switching up our stitch pattern. So I'm going to be purling where I previously have these flat knit stitches and knitting where I have these previously worked purl stitches. So it says slip 1, then purl 2. When I slip that first stitch, I want to make sure my working yarn stays in the back, and then I have to purl 2. So after I've slipped that stitch, I'm going to bring my working yarn to the front and I'm going to purl the next 2 stitches. So now I've done the slip 1, purl 2, and now I can just get right into that pattern, right? Bring my yarn to the back, knit the next 3 stitches, bring my yarn to the front, purl the next 3. And what slipping those stitches does is it creates a nice clean edge along the side of your blanket. So you can see on both sides here, I have that same slip stitch edge. So you always want to make sure you're slipping that first stitch. It's just on rows 1 of both set 1 and set 2, you have to think about where the yarn is as you're slipping that first stitch. So now I'm going to continue working row 1 of set 2, then I'll work row 2 and row 3, and then I'll go back up to set 1, right? Work all 3 rows there, set 2, work all 3 rows there. And I'm going to continue repeating the 6 rows over and over again until it measures roughly 60 inches. You do also want to make sure you finish after a row 3. It doesn't matter if it's a set 1 row 3 or a set 2 row 3, just as long as it's a row 3 that you just finished working. And I'll come back and I'll show you the cast off. Now, once you've reached that 60-inch threshold, you're all ready to cast off. And you do want to make sure you just finished one of the repeat sets. So I've just worked all 3 of those rows, and now I'm going to cast off. Something you want to keep in mind as you're casting off, and my swatches showed this really well, is you want to make sure you cast off really loosely. So what do I mean by that? If we look at our 2 swatches here, this swatch over here, I did not cast off loosely. So what's happened is my cast on edge is nice and stretchy, my fabric's nice and stretchy, but my cast off edge is really tight, and it causes this kind of strange shape to happen here. We don't want that to happen because we just spent so long on our blanket. What we want to make sure we do instead is we want to cast off loosely. So here's my other swatch, and for this one I have my cast on edge down there at the bottom, so you can see that backward loop cast on created a nice stretch, and then up here at the top I've cast it off much more loosely than I did in my previous one. So if I kind of compare them side by side here, this one really tapers in. This one, I can get much more of that rectangular shape. So you want to make sure as you're casting off nice and loosely to create an edge that has a little bit of give to it. You don't want it so tight that it's tapering in. So how do you actually do this? What you want to do as you're going across the top edge is you just want to make sure you're really making each one of the stitches as large as they can be. As I start off the cast off edge, I'm actually going to slip the first stitch still, just so that edge stays really nice. Bring my yarn to the back, and I'm going to knit all the stitches going all the way across. I'm not going to worry about doing any sort of special pattern. So I'm going to pull that first stitch a little bit bigger, so there's plenty of space in there, and now I'm going to knit the next stitch. Now I want to take the previous stitch using my left knitting needle and pull that stitch up over and off the second stitch. So that's technically how you cast off one stitch. So let me show you the repeat again. First, I'm going to make sure I don't have the stitch on my knitting needle too tight, right? So I have some space in there. I'm going to knit the next stitch, and now I'm going to take my previous stitch using my left knitting needle, and I'm going to slip it up, over, and off. Now again, I pull on that stitch on my right knitting needle just to make it a little bit bigger so nothing gets too tight. So I have a nice little gap in there. Gonna knit the next stitch, past the previous stitch, up, over, and off. Then again, I make that stitch a little bigger. And I just keep on doing this all the way across the cast off edge. So I'll show you what mine starts to look like as I get a bit further along. Now that I've gotten a few stitches in, I want to show you what it looks like. So first thing you'll notice about my cast off edge is it does have a little bit of stretch to it, but it doesn't have a ton of stretch. That's just something that commonly happens with cast off edges. The main thing you want to look out for is you want to make sure your work isn't tapering inwards, right? Because that means we're casting off too tightly and we're going to end up in this sort of a situation where the work is curling inwards, right? That one was really tight. And then you also want to make sure you aren't pulling them too loosely, right? Because then you'll actually have your work like going outwards or starting to ripple. So you want to find that happy little middle ground. And the nice thing about it is if you haven't gotten too far, you can still adjust, right? So if I notice it's getting too tight, I can just pull each one of those loops a little bit bigger as I'm casting off. That way there's a little bit more space in my work. Or if I notice it's doing the opposite, I can pull them slightly tighter. Now I'm over here at the final stitch. So I'm going to work that one just as I have the previous ones. And I'll end up with just one loop on my right knitting needle. So here we want to cut our yarn, and I'm going to leave somewhere between like 12 and 18 inches to weave in. Now with my knitting needle, I'm going to pull that loop a little bit larger, and I'm going to thread that yarn tail that I just cut through that loop. Then you can tighten to secure. So now essentially you just made a little knot there at the end. So now we need to weave in those ends. So first end I'm going to weave in, it's going to be this one right here. You do need a large tapestry needle in order to be able to weave these in. So what I like to do to weave in my ends, the cast off and cast on, and anywhere I joined balls of yarn as well, is I just follow along with stitches. So I try to pick out where I can see stitches have gone in my work, and I'm just going to mimic exactly the movements they made. That way it should blend in quite nicely. Now once I've woven in for a bit, I'm going to cut that yarn pretty close to my work so then it blends in nicely. Now I got to go through the rest of the blanket and weave in all those ends as well. Where I join balls of yarn and there's two yarn tails going at the same time, I do like to tie those together first to make a little knot before I weave in the ends in either direction. Thank you so much for joining me today as we knit this simple basket weave blanket. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And I did also want to add in one extra little thing you could add to your blanket is a fun little tag. So I'll put in a zoom picture of these on the video version, but I've ordered these little tiny by KnittingHouseSquare tags that I'm going to start attaching to my gifts. And this is going to be a Christmas gift for me. So my last step of my project is going to be to sew on my new knitting tags. So I'll leave a link down below as to where I got these. It's not an affiliate link. I just had a fun time designing this little tag, and I think others would as well. So I will see you next time.